The hearing room was colder than Jasmine expected, the kind of sterile chill that seeped into your skin even under layers of professional decorum. Rows of journalists sat shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, tapping out half-finished headlines before anyone had spoken. Jasmine Crockett didn't need the headlines to know what today was about. She could read it in the looks, that uneasy mixture of curiosity and hunger. The Committee on Federal Housing and Economic Opportunity was supposed to be a policy discussion. But everyone knew it was going to turn personal the moment Karoline Leavitt walked in. Karoline was late on purpose, she always was, when she wanted to make an entrance. When the door finally swung open, her stride was quick and confident, her dark blue dress crisp as if she'd changed minutes before stepping in. She didn't look at Jasmine right away. She made a show of acknowledging the cameras, her staff, the chairman. Only then did she lift her chin, her eyes locking on Jasmine's as if they'd already agreed to hate each other. Jasmine felt her pulse thump in her throat, not because she was nervous, she'd argued with worse, survived worse, but because she understood exactly what Karoline was about to try. For weeks, leaks from Karoline's staff hinted she planned to question Jasmine's credibility. A code word, Jasmine knew, for every insinuation that she hadn't earned her place. It wasn't fear that made her tense her jaw. It was anticipation. Because if Karoline thought she could turn this hearing into a public shaming, she hadn't studied Jasmine nearly enough. Representative Crockett, the chairman began, tapping his gavel once, "Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your insights on housing equity." "Thank you," Jasmine said calmly, her voice carrying further than she expected. She let her eyes flick to Karoline, just for a heartbeat, and then back to the chairman. She wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a stare down. Karoline leaned into her microphone as if she'd been waiting hours for this moment. "Mr. Chairman, if I may," she purred, her tone sugary but sharp around the edges, "I'd like to start by asking Representative Crockett a question about her record, and her motivations." The word motivations carried weight, like she was preparing to unwrap something the cameras would salivate over. The chairman glanced uneasily between them. "Proceed." Karoline folded her hands in front of her, her nails painted the color of dried blood. "Representative Crockett, you've made a lot of noise about fairness. But isn't it true that the only reason you even sit on this committee is because your husband," she paused just long enough for the air to thicken, "pulled strings? That your entire career has been propped up by the connections you married into?" A soft gasp rippled along the back wall. Jasmine didn't blink. She'd expected Karoline to come for her credentials. But she hadn't expected her to come for her marriage. Not in front of the country. And in that half-second of silence, as Karoline's smirk spread across her face, Jasmine felt something she hadn't felt in years, the heat of old humiliation. But she also felt something else, a cold clarity that always arrived just before she decided to fight back. The hearing room didn't erupt. It did something worse, it went still. That sticky, suffocating hush that always settled when a woman was publicly humiliated and people weren't sure if they were supposed to intervene. Karoline knew exactly what she was doing. Her smirk was carefully measured, the performance of someone who had practiced that line in front of a mirror. Jasmine could see the calculation behind her eyes, make it personal. Make it sting. Make her lose composure. A young reporter near the aisle raised her phone, pretending to check messages but really recording the moment. Jasmine's gaze slipped over the lenses and notepads, then back to Karoline. She had been underestimated all her life, but she had never been invisible. That was why this moment mattered, not just for her but for everyone watching who had ever had their accomplishments reduced to someone else's name. Slowly, Jasmine picked up her pen and set it back down, a small movement that felt louder than Karoline's accusation. It was her way of saying, "I decide when this begins." "Congresswoman Leavitt," she said finally, her voice low and steady, "I'm not surprised you bring up my marriage. It's easier to question a woman's worth than to examine why so many of your policies fail the people you claim to serve." Karoline didn't flinch. She tilted her head in feigned curiosity, eyes bright with something that looked like triumph. "I'm simply stating facts. You've never addressed the role your husband's career played in your rise. The public deserves transparency. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. Congresswoman. No, let her finish, Jasmine interrupted, her tone silk over steel. I want everyone here to hear every word she feels entitled to say. Karoline's smile stretched wider. Then I will. Because the truth is, when you talk about housing, when you talk about justice, you forget to mention that you live in a house your husband bought with money from clients he met while you were still defending petty criminals. You forget to mention that without his reputation, I would still be here, Jasmine cut in, her voice cutting through the air so cleanly it felt like glass breaking. For a moment, no one spoke. Karoline's lips parted, as if she'd been about to launch another attack, but she hesitated. Because Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't gotten angry. And somehow, that made it worse. Jasmine leaned forward, folding her hands on the table, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. Let me explain something to you, she continued, her tone calm but sharpened to a point. My husband didn't run for office. My husband didn't sit in courtrooms until 2 a.m. fighting for kids nobody else would represent. My husband didn't spend a decade working cases pro bono because families couldn't afford the legal fees. I did. Every syllable landed heavy, a quiet percussion that swallowed the snide tension Karoline had tried to conjure. And you know what's even more interesting? Jasmine said, her voice dropping lower. The fact that you think a woman's marriage is her most convenient weakness says more about you than it does about me. A rustle spread through the press gallery, journalists scribbling faster, microphones adjusting. Karoline's smile thinned. She hadn't expected Jasmine to stay composed. She certainly hadn't expected her to start reclaiming the narrative. Jasmine didn't look away. She let the silence stretch, daring Karoline to keep going. Because if she did, Jasmine was ready to burn every last scrap of her argument to the ground. Karoline's fingers drummed against the polished oak table, slow, deliberate, as if she were buying time to recalculate. For a moment, she looked like she might back off, pivot to something safer, but ambition was an addiction she'd never been able to control. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. Well, Karoline began, it's touching that you believe your career stands apart from your husband's influence. But let's be honest with the American people, marriage is a partnership. Surely you're not suggesting you've achieved everything alone. It was a rhetorical trap, the kind designed to corner any woman who refused to shrink. If Jasmine denied her husband support, she'd look ungrateful. If she acknowledged it, Karoline would spin it as proof she owed everything to a man. Jasmine saw it for exactly what it was, a performance. And she decided she wasn't going to play her part. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't search the room for validation. She looked straight at Karoline, her expression quiet, almost sympathetic. I am suggesting, Jasmine replied evenly, that a woman can love someone and still be her own person. That a marriage can be a partnership without being a crutch. And that your inability to grasp that says more about your insecurities than my reality. A couple of aides sitting behind Karoline traded a glance. The smirk Karoline had been wearing began to falter, the shine dimming from her eyes as she realized Jasmine wasn't going to crumble. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She leaned back, letting the chair creak just enough to break the hush that had settled over the chamber. Let's talk about what we're actually here to discuss, she continued, lifting a stack of housing reports and tapping them lightly on the table. Because while you're dissecting my personal life, there are families 2 eviction notices away from homelessness. There are veterans living under highway overpasses in your own district. There are children who don't care whose name is on my mortgage, they just want a roof that doesn't leak. A flash of irritation crossed Karoline's face, but she tried to disguise it behind a placid blink. You're deflecting, she said. No, Jasmine replied, her voice cooling to something almost clinical. I'm prioritizing. She reached into her folder and pulled out a photograph, a little girl in a faded yellow dress standing on the steps of a boarded-up duplex. Jasmine held it up so the cameras could see, her hand steady. "Her name is Aaliyah," she said. "She's 6 years old. Last winter, she and her mother huddled in this building with no heat for 6 weeks because the landlord refused to fix the boiler. When the city threatened to condemn the property, they had nowhere else to go. And while you were strategizing your next media appearance, my office was working to keep them from freezing to death. No one moved. No one breathed." Jasmine set the photo down gently. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Because the story itself was louder than any accusation Karoline could throw. "And if you think that the woman who stood on those porch steps and looked that mother in the eye is going to be shamed out of this fight because of who she married," Jasmine's eyes locked with Karoline's, unblinking. "You don't know me at all." The chairman cleared his throat, clearly relieved for a chance to interrupt. "Perhaps we should return to the matter at hand." But Jasmine didn't move. She let her words, and the truth behind them, fill every inch of the room. Because she knew the next time Karoline tried to question her worth, it wouldn't land nearly as cleanly. For almost a full minute, nobody dared speak. Even the reporters in the back seemed to sense they were witnessing something that would outlast the news cycle. The camera light stayed fixed on Jasmine, highlighting the calm set of her shoulders, the quiet defiance in her eyes. Karoline shifted again, her composure cracked just enough for everyone to see it. She swallowed, then flicked her gaze toward the chairman, hoping for a procedural escape hatch. But he only lifted an eyebrow, as if to say, "You wanted this exchange. Finish it." Slowly, Karoline exhaled. "Representative Crockett," she began, trying to summon that same smug confidence, "I'm sure you think your anecdotes are compelling. But policy shouldn't be made based on emotional appeals. It should be rooted in facts, facts you conveniently avoid whenever you're questioned." Jasmine didn't so much as blink. She simply tilted her head, studying Karoline the way a seasoned attorney might study a witness about to perjure themselves. "You're right," Jasmine said softly. "Policy should be rooted in facts." She reached into her binder and lifted out a sheaf of printed spreadsheets, each stapled with color-coded tabs. "So let's look at some. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2024 report, evictions have risen 14% in your district since you took office as an aide. Affordable housing permits fell by 21%. And the number of children classified as chronically homeless doubled." Karoline's lips parted. "Just slightly. Just enough." Jasmine continued, her tone measured and almost gentle, like she was simply correcting a student's homework. "These are your constituents. And while you're here questioning whether my marriage invalidates my work, they're wondering why you haven't lifted a finger to help them." A hush spread across the rows of congressional staffers. Even the chairman looked caught between discomfort and fascination. Karoline opened her mouth, but Jasmine raised a single finger, never aggressive, never loud, just enough to reclaim the floor. "And since we're being transparent," Jasmine continued, "I'll share something personal. When I was a public defender, my husband was a sitting federal judge. Do you know how many times that was used to discredit my work? To imply I was only hired because of him?" She let the question hang, her voice steady. "I lost count," she said quietly. "But I didn't walk away. Because I understood something you still don't: respect isn't something you inherit from a last name. It's something you earn when you keep showing up, especially when people try to humiliate you." Karoline tried to interrupt, but Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "And here's the part you really won't understand," Jasmine continued, softer now. "The people I serve don't care whose ring I wear. They care that when their heat gets turned off or their landlord locks them out, someone answers the phone. Someone shows up. It wasn't grandstanding. It was the truth, plain and undeniable." Karoline's jaw tightened. She shifted her papers, desperate to regain control of the narrative. But Jasmine had already made it clear, she wasn't there to be diminished. She was there to be heard. And she wasn't finished yet. Karoline exhaled through her nose, a short, clipped sound that gave her away more than any words could have. She looked past Jasmine toward the cameras, searching for the script she'd prepared in her mind. But something about the room had changed. The tension wasn't working in her favor anymore. She tried to recover, her voice slipping back into that polished, media-trained cadence. "Representative Crockett," she began, "you're very skilled at dramatizing personal hardship. But the American people aren't looking for a reality show. They're looking for solutions. For discipline. For accountability." It was the line she'd rehearsed a dozen times, the line that framed Jasmine as emotional, unprofessional, somehow less serious. And if Jasmine had been anyone else, maybe it would have worked. But she wasn't anyone else. Jasmine didn't pick up her notes. She didn't even glance down. She let the quiet spool out until the air felt tight. Then she spoke, her voice low and unwavering. "You're right," she said, "the American people are looking for accountability." She shifted forward in her seat just enough that the microphone caught every word without amplification. "So let's talk about accountability." Karoline's lips parted, but Jasmine didn't give her the chance to jump in. "Accountability," Jasmine continued, "is when a woman stands in a room she wasn't supposed to survive, with people waiting for her to crack, and chooses not to. Accountability is when you don't hide behind talking points or clever insults because you're afraid of being ordinary. Accountability is showing up to do the work, even when it's not glamorous, even when no one gives you credit." She let her gaze rest on Karoline, not with anger, but with something far more disarming, pity. "You keep trying to turn my marriage into a scandal," Jasmine went on, "because it's easier than admitting that when the cameras are off, you have nothing else to stand on." The room seemed to shrink around them. Reporters leaned forward, their pens hovering over notepads. Even the chairman stopped shuffling his papers. Karoline tried to interrupt, but her voice cracked on the first syllable. Jasmine didn't flinch. "You call it dramatizing," Jasmine said, her tone soft and deliberate. "I call it telling the truth. And the truth is, I'm not ashamed of the life I built. Or the man who stood beside me while I built it. What I am ashamed of is the way you think you can weaponize a woman's personal story to distract from your lack of one." A quiet ripple moved through the press gallery. The cameras were locked on Jasmine now, not because she was performing, but because she was refusing to. "You want discipline?" Jasmine asked, her voice so even it almost sounded tender. "Here it is. Discipline is refusing to let someone else's bitterness become your burden. Discipline is knowing your purpose so clearly that no one can shame you out of it." Karoline's face was blank. Not furious. Not triumphant. Just, stalled, like a machine that had finally overheated. Jasmine sat back, folding her hands in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown any insults. And somehow, that made her words land twice as hard. And in that moment, everyone watching understood. Karoline had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. And Jasmine wasn't done. The chairman cleared his throat, but even he didn't seem eager to interrupt. For a few seconds, the hearing felt less like a policy session and more like a reckoning, one that had been building long before either of them took their seats. Karoline straightened her shoulders, her jaw locked tight. But her voice betrayed her as soon as she spoke. "You can posture all you want," she said, each word stiff as glass, "but the fact remains, you never addressed the original point. Without your husband's career, you wouldn't be here." Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't sigh or look away. Instead, she folded her hands again and let her tone drop so low the microphone barely picked it up, forcing the room to lean closer. "Without my husband's career," she said, "I'd still be here. Because I didn't marry into my convictions. I earned them." A hush so complete fell over the chamber that Jasmine could hear the quiet rattle of a vent somewhere above her. Karoline's mouth opened, but Jasmine lifted a hand, not to silence her, but to finish her thought. "And you know how I know I'd still be here," she continued, her voice calm as a held breath. "Because before I ever stood behind a congressional nameplate, I stood in courtrooms where nobody knew my husband's name. Where nobody cared that my shoes had holes or that I sometimes skipped dinner to pay the copier bill. Where all that mattered was whether I could stand up for someone who had no one else. Her gaze didn't waver. You think power is something you inherit, she went on, softer now. But the truth is, power is what's left after you've been underestimated so long you learn to stop needing approval. The reporters were motionless, pens hovering in midair. A producer at the back, headset crooked over one ear, whispered, "We need this feed, now." Jasmine paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her binder. "You know what the hardest part of this job is?" she asked, voice steady. "It's not the hours. Not the policies. Not the politics. It's having to prove, over and over, that your voice deserves to be in the room. That you didn't come here because someone propped you up. That you came here because you refused to stay out." Karoline's expression shifted, but Jasmine couldn't tell whether it was anger or something closer to embarrassment. "I will never apologize for the life I've built," Jasmine continued, her tone almost gentle. "And I will never apologize for the people who stood beside me while I built it. Because that's what real partnership looks like. Not dependency, mutual respect." The chairman finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Perhaps we should." But Jasmine wasn't finished. She lifted her chin, meeting Karoline's stare without hesitation. "And let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice returning to its full volume, "if you think you can shame me out of this work, you're going to be disappointed. Because I don't scare that easy." Karoline's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her knuckles were white where they gripped her notes. Jasmine didn't look away. She simply settled back in her chair, letting the silence say what she didn't have to. "Your move." Karoline's fingers trembled just enough to betray her composure as she shuffled her papers. For a moment, she looked almost young, like a kid caught bluffing in a high-stakes game she never fully understood. But the cameras were still rolling, and pride was a stubborn thing. She cleared her throat, voice tight. "I think we've established that Representative Crockett believes her personal story entitles her to moral superiority." "No," Jasmine interjected, her tone gentle but immovable, "I believe it entitles me to credibility." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Jasmine didn't flinch. "Because the difference between you and me," she continued, "is that I've lived the consequences of the policies we debate. You learned them from a briefing packet." Karoline opened her mouth again, but Jasmine didn't give her time to pivot. She leaned forward, her wedding ring catching the overhead lights, her voice so steady it felt almost surgical. "And let's be honest," she said, "this was never about policy for you. It was about perception. About making sure anyone watching would wonder whether I deserved this seat. Whether a woman like me could possibly get here without a man pulling strings." Karoline shifted her gaze to the chairman, but Jasmine kept talking. "You came here to humiliate me," she said, not raising her voice, not even sounding angry. "You thought if you framed me as someone dependent, you could discredit every word I say about affordable housing. About poverty. About why this government keeps failing people who don't look like you." A fresh stillness settled over the room. It wasn't the brittle hush of tension anymore. It was the heavy quiet that arrived when everyone finally understood exactly what was happening. "And you know what?" Jasmine continued, her tone softening just a fraction. "I'm not angry that you tried it. I'm disappointed that you thought it would work." Karoline's jaw clenched. She dropped her gaze to her prepared notes, but they looked flimsy now, just words on paper that couldn't shield her from the truth. Jasmine let the moment breathe, then turned back to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, "if Representative Leavitt is finished questioning my personal life, perhaps we can return to the issue at hand, the housing crisis affecting millions of Americans who don't have the luxury of sitting here debating whether their story is palatable enough for public consumption." The chairman nodded, almost gratefully. "Yes. Let's proceed." But Jasmine wasn't quite done. She turned to Karoline one last time. "For what it's worth, she said, her voice low and clear, "I hope someday you realize that diminishing another woman's work doesn't make your own any more meaningful." Karoline didn't respond. Couldn't. Jasmine let her gaze settle, not in triumph, but in quiet certainty. Because this wasn't about scoring points. It was about reclaiming the ground Karoline had tried to pull out from under her feet. And the remarkable thing was, she had done it without ever raising her voice. The next speaker cleared his throat, awkwardly shuffling his papers to signal a return to business as usual. But nothing about the moment felt usual. Even the fluorescent lights seemed harsher, as if they were spotlighting everything that had been laid bare. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly over the binder in front of her. She could feel the aftershock in the room, the way eyes kept drifting back to her, the way the silence felt less like discomfort now and more like respect. Karoline didn't speak again for several minutes. When she finally did, her voice was stripped of its earlier confidence. "I yield my time," she said, almost too quietly for the microphone to catch. A staffer behind her reached forward and discreetly switched off her mic. It was the smallest gesture, but it said everything. The next witness began reciting prepared testimony about affordable housing shortages, but Jasmine only half listened. Her mind drifted, past the cameras, past the committee table, back to the first time someone had tried to tell her she didn't belong. She had been 24, a fresh law school graduate with student loans and a used Honda that stalled every time it rained. A senior partner at a firm she'd applied to had skimmed her resume, raised a single eyebrow, and asked, "Who vouched for you?" Not "What do you believe in?" Not "Why do you want this?" Just "Who made it okay for you to be here?" It was the same question Karoline had asked, just dressed up in more official language. She felt the memory simmer in her chest, not as anger, but as proof of how many times she'd already survived this exact moment. Across the table, Karoline shifted in her seat, her shoulders rigid as she stared down at the stack of untouched notes. Her aides hovered behind her, clearly unsure whether to step in or let her absorb the fallout alone. Jasmine exhaled slowly. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt certain. Because she knew something Karoline still didn't. No matter how many times you tried to diminish someone, you couldn't erase the work they'd already done. You couldn't undo the people they'd helped. You couldn't invalidate a record built in the spaces where cameras never reached. And you definitely couldn't shame someone who'd already learned how to survive without approval. The chairman finally spoke, his voice measured but cautious. "Representative Crockett, if you'd like to offer any final remarks on the record, you may." Jasmine lifted her gaze, meeting the chairman's eyes, then the cameras. "I don't have a prepared statement," she said, her tone calm and resolute. "But I will say this, I'm here because I earned it. I'm here because my constituents trusted me to fight for them, not to trade insults in front of a microphone. And I'm here because the families who call my office aren't interested in who I married. They're interested in whether I'll show up." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And I will," she finished. "Every single time." A quiet chorus of clicks echoed through the chamber as reporters hit send on their drafts. No one was pretending this was just another hearing anymore. Because even in Washington, a place built on ego and performance, authenticity still had the power to stop the room cold. When the committee recessed, the room didn't immediately empty out the way it usually did. Reporters lingered, whispering to each other in clipped, excited tones. Staffers hovered near the walls, some pretending to tidy up documents just to stay a little longer. Jasmine gathered her notes slowly, giving herself the time to breathe before she stood. She could feel Karoline's eyes flickering up, then darting away again. For a moment, Jasmine almost pitied her. Almost. Because she knew the look on Karoline's face. She'd seen it before, on men who called her "young lady" in court, on colleagues who tried to bury her proposals in committee, on pundits who said she was too ambitious to be trusted. It was the look of someone realizing too late that the narrative they tried to script was no longer under their control. A producer approached with a small camera crew in tow. "Representative Crockett, he began carefully, "Would you mind answering a few questions before you leave?" Jasmine considered it. Every instinct told her to walk past the cameras, to let her words from the hearing stand on their own. But she also knew something bigger was happening, something that wasn't just about her. She turned to face the cameras, her expression composed but unguarded. "Sure," she said. "Go ahead." The producer glanced at his notes. "How do you respond to critics who say you were too personal in your remarks to Representative Leavitt?" Jasmine didn't look at Karoline, who sat a few yards away, pretending to scroll her phone. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on the lens. "I'd say this," she began, her voice clear but never harsh. "If standing up for your own integrity is considered too personal, maybe the problem isn't with me. Maybe it's with a culture that expects women to stay quiet when their worth is attacked." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the staffers standing near the doorway. The producer nodded, pressing on. "Do you regret how direct you were?" "No," Jasmine said simply. "I don't regret telling the truth." The simplicity of it seemed to catch the reporter off guard. No spin. No deflection. Just fact. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, feeling a rush of clarity she hadn't expected. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. It was about showing every person watching, every woman who had ever been told she owed her accomplishments to someone else, that you don't have to justify your place. Karoline finally rose from her chair, gathering her papers with movements that were just a little too fast. Jasmine watched her for a moment, remembering something her grandmother used to say, "People will call you ungrateful the moment you stop needing their approval." She felt a quiet gratitude then, not for Karoline's attack, but for the chance to answer it in her own words, on her own terms. As the camera crew stepped back, Jasmine turned to leave the chamber. A few reporters called her name, but she didn't stop. She didn't need to. Because the story wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to every woman who had ever been asked to explain her success as if it were a borrowed coat. And she wasn't going to apologize for wearing it. Jasmine stepped into the hallway, the noise from the chamber trailing behind her like an echo she no longer needed to answer. Her aides fell into step around her, each of them silent, each understanding that some moments were too heavy to fill with chatter. She paused at the end of the corridor, pressing a palm against the cool marble wall. It wasn't exhaustion she felt, it was relief. The kind that came from saying what needed to be said, no matter who was listening. One of her staffers, a young woman named Lila, cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tentative, "there are already thousands of comments pouring in. Messages, too. Some pretty hostile. Some really supportive." Jasmine turned, studying her with a tired but steady gaze. "I know," she said. "There always are." She remembered the first time she had gone viral, a clip of her defending a teenage boy in juvenile court, back when she still wore second-hand suits and drove a car that leaked rainwater. Back then, she thought being noticed would finally make things easier. It hadn't. But it had made her stronger. A staffer handed her a phone with a live feed of the news. The headline crawled across the bottom in bold letters. "Crockett confronts Leavitt over personal attack, I don't scare that easy." Karoline's team had already issued a statement, thin and hollow, describing the exchange as a spirited policy disagreement. But everyone knew it was more than that. Everyone who watched had seen the exact moment the conversation turned, when Jasmine refused to be diminished. She scrolled past hundreds of messages, most from strangers. Some were cruel. Some were nothing more than tired tropes about angry women, ungrateful women, ambitious women. But buried between them were words that mattered. A note from a retired nurse in Cleveland, "Thank you for standing up for yourself. For all of us." A message from a law student in Atlanta, "I've been afraid to speak up. You reminded me why I shouldn't be." A simple line from a woman she'd never met in Tulsa, "We saw you. We heard you." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it land. Not the hate. Not the noise. The recognition. Lila hesitated. Do you want me to draft a response? No, Jasmine said, shaking her head. Not yet. Because she knew that whatever she posted, whatever she said next, would be analyzed, dissected, reframed. And she was willing to face that. But for this 1 hour, just this hour, she wanted to stand in the quiet knowledge that she hadn't backed down. When she finally stepped outside into the bright afternoon light, a breeze tugged at her hair. She lifted her face to it, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks, peace. Karoline might never understand that this was never about a marriage or a headline. It was about a simple, immovable truth, one Jasmine had spent her whole life proving. You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving. You don't owe anyone an explanation for being here. You don't owe everything to anyone but yourself. And you certainly don't owe your silence to people who've never earned it. She exhaled slowly, then walked down the steps, one hand resting lightly over her wedding ring. Not as an emblem of weakness, but as proof of the life she'd built on her own terms. The cameras clicked and flashed, but she didn't turn back. She didn't need to. Because this time, she knew the story didn't belong to the people behind the microphones. It belonged to her. And she intended to keep it that way. When people look back on this day, they won't remember every statistic, every prepared remark, or every talking point. They'll remember the moment a woman refused to be reduced to someone else's story. They'll remember that when her worth was questioned, not by policy but by a cheap personal attack, she didn't flinch, didn't hide, and didn't apologize for the life she had built. They'll remember that dignity isn't something you're granted because of who you married, where you came from, or whose approval you earned. It's something you claim when you stand your ground, even when every voice around you says you don't belong. And they'll remember that real power isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It doesn't need to humiliate to feel important. Real power is quiet. Real power is earned. And real power is the voice that says, without a trace of shame, I am here because I deserve to be. I don't owe you my silence. I don't owe you my fear. And I don't owe you my story. I am the one who will decide what it means.